had a good clip, and we're going to be completing Chapter 9. Now, I said I had some good news for you guys. Here's the good news. My original plan was to cover 2 more chapters outside of class in an online format, in addition to what we were covering in class. What we're going to be doing instead at this point, that would have been 4 total chapters we had yet to cover. We're not doing that. I'm going to selectively cover 2 more chapters in an online format, and your final will be during our online scheduled time, a total of 3 chapters. 2 of those 3 chapters will be covered online. Your entire final is going to be open book, open notes. So the good news there is instead of covering 4 chapters online like the original plan was, we're covering 2. So the chapter we covered in class here, Chapter 9, will be on that exam. But you can use your notes, you can use your book, you can use anything we've talked about, and 2 more chapters will be on there. I'm determining which of the remaining chapters I'm going to stick in. What we're going to do, because the final is scheduled on 12/13, I have to go back to actually look at what time it is. I'll be opening that exam at the scheduled time, and I'll be closing it pretty close to the end of that scheduled time too. So you're going to have 2 hours to take the test. Have your materials with you. Make sure you have everything close by. I've got to hold it during the scheduled time. I may let it go a little long, but we have to do it at that time. Are you guys clear what we're doing here? Okay, is that an acceptable way to end the class? Because what I want to do next week, so that we don't have to do our collective bargaining during final exam time, on Monday when we get back, I'm going to be covering the exercise. We're going to be establishing teams. I'm going to be providing documentation to you. What we're going to be negotiating is a contract. The scenario is something I'm still working out. To be honest with you, I'm going to be spending my holiday largely working on this to create a quality experience for you guys. And the way it's going to work, Monday we're going to spend time preparing. When people gather into small groups to talk amongst themselves, what do we call that? You're going to be caucusing on Monday to go through the contract. On Wednesday and Friday, the week of final, or week before finals rather, we actually will establish sides. We'll come to a collective bargaining agreement. So the first day of collective bargaining will be Wednesday. I imagine both sides may agree on some things and disagree on some things. We'll have to go away and we'll come back on Friday to finish the debate. The goal is going to be, by the time we walk out of here on Friday, the first week of December, is we walk out with a collective bargaining agreement that union and management can agree upon. Now, if you hit an impasse, for example, what could happen? If labor doesn't like the contract, what can labor do? Strike. There's a possibility we might have a strike. You never know. There's a possibility we might have a lockout on the part of management. They decide that the union's being unreasonable. Those are tactics you can deploy. I would suggest, though, considering all the options that we're going to be laying out for you, things that are going to be big deal. Healthcare is a big deal. Wages are a big deal. Terms and conditions of employment are a big deal. Mandatory bargaining subjects. Pay is a mandatory bargaining subject. Working conditions is a mandatory bargaining subject. What kind of soaps in the soap dispensers is not a mandatory bargaining subject. So there's going to be both kinds of aspects in the agreement. You're going to be scored as a team based on how much you're willing to participate. If you don't get an agreement, if we don't come to consensus and we get a lockout or a strike, that doesn't mean you didn't do well on the assignment, so long as you walk through 100%. I expect everybody in this room to be an active participant. It'll make sense when we get back on Monday. Do you guys have any questions? Yes? Do you have a question, Sarah? I'm going to be scoring you basically on a scale where both teams share the score. I'll have a scoring rubric for you guys, and it's going to be based more on participation than actual skill. Were you tying in things we talked about in the class? Were you negotiating? Were you being willing to talk to the other side? We'll have all this, and we'll go through it all on the Monday we get back. So guys, that's our plan for the rest of what remains of this semester. Guys, we're going to move quickly today. We're going to be taking a few breaks just to keep things going. But in terms of the employer, if the employer experiences a strike or has a lockout, they decide to lock out the folks who are working for them, what are the costs that you might get? Well, the costs are, for example, you're not making money. If you're making a product and you can't make a product because you either lock out your workers or they're on strike, it's going to hit you where it counts in the bank account. You still have to pay your facilities. You still have to pay your guards to be at the facilities. You still have to have the lights on. All of these things continue to rack up costs. At the same time, you might be getting legal fees if you're paying lawyers, which you probably are. You also are going to have negative publicity if the public sentiment is against the company. And the biggest part, too, it's just like, for example, if you have a married couple, by the time they go to marriage counseling, things are on shaky ground, but they're still okay. It's a whole different ballgame when somebody finally moves out of the house. And what happens here, if you hit a strike or a lockout, somebody has moved out. So the relationship itself has changed. So you may have a negative relationship as well. If you're an employer, some of the ways that you can limit some of these costs, for example, if you were GM, you had a nice big inventory before the strike happened. Did GM ever run out of cars in 2 months, or in a month rather? No, you could get pretty much anything you wanted. They had a month and a half worth of inventory. They were good to weather that storm. Some other things, if you're the employer, for example, you may want to make sure you're getting good PR, for example. You might want to make sure that people are hearing your side of it. You're going to want to stay open to the extent you can. If there are other places you can be pulling in revenue, just because one part of your company shut down with a strike, for example. And you also could purchase what's called strike insurance. They literally have something called strike insurance for employers, so that you can get minimal payments if your employees go on strike. Now, you're paying a premium for that to just get some minimal money rolling in during a strike, but those are things that we can do. So what can unions do? Well, unions have a strike pension, for example. They can pay out people, but it's very difficult for unions to stay afloat during strikes as well, because if people aren't getting paid, what are they not paying? They're not paying their dues. Exactly right. And if people are not getting paid and they're not paying their dues, they're also not happy about it. You might get minimal strike insurance. Does anybody remember? What were GM workers getting for strike insurance? What was the amount? How much were they making a week? Remember? I'm sorry? It was like $250. And it was $250 a week, down from somebody who was making $45 an hour. Think about that. You're basically getting like 5 to 6 hours worth of paycheck for your strike pay. It's a big difference. It's a big difference. So some of the other things too, guys, the union itself doesn't really want to strike most of the time. It's good that they're able to show power, but their constituents want to earn. The other things too, if you're a union, because you also have to rely on that revenue and your business, your expenses now are coming out of your strike funds as well, and you've got more folks who are being stressed and not happy with you. If you're a union, some of the things you can do to minimize the cost, you can save for a rainy day. You can make sure you have money in your strike accounts. You can try to keep the workers charged up about it, and you're going to want to keep positive publicity coming. For example, I'll give you a great example. When the nurses union at UPMC Altoona went on strike, their biggest issues were not pay or job security. Their biggest issues were patient ratios. They wanted to make sure that, for example, people weren't taking care of too many patients. Is that something that has a public interest angle? Yeah. You're basically saying, we're going on strike because we care about our patients. That's a good PR angle. Somebody's saying we're going on strike because we want more money, even though we make more money than most people in this region. Not a good way to create good publicity. So in terms of other ways that people can reduce that cost, for example, we can establish groups, we can establish food banks. They do that for people who are on strike. They get strike benefits. One of the things that really happens in communities, think about this. If you've got an industrial community, you've got people who all work at a single factory, whatever, there also tend to be a lot of community groups, churches, people who are willing to step in and lend a hand to try to offset the perils of people who are on strike. It could be gift cards for the local grocery store. It could be the idea of trying to get people other temporary work, for example. So there are lots of different ways in which people strike. Unfair labor practices. For example, if the employer is engaged in a unfair labor practice and the employees decide to go on strike, and if it's a strike they do on their own, they may or may not be entitled to back pay, but they're going out on strike to protest something that's an unfair labor practice. If later on the unfair labor practice is proven not to have existed, according to NLRB, you're not getting paid for the strike. You might even lose your job. Economic strikes are people who go on strike because they want to be able to have better pay. So that can also be somebody who would go out and say, well, the conditions of pay aren't good. We haven't gotten a raise since the recession of 2008. So these folks, however, if it's not an authorized strike, they can be replaced as well. Some of the other things that happen, guys, if you are striking, do you guys remember when we had our guests from the United Mine Workers in here? What are some of the tactics that the United Mine Workers deployed in Cambria County that may be somewhat questioned? Yes? That's pretty amazing, wasn't it? Like, I still have those up in my office. So we're talking about that. We're talking about throwing rocks at quote-unquote scab trucks, physically intimidating people. That stuff is flat out illegal. It's considered to be serious strike misconduct, and the NLRB won't stand for that either. If you're on strike, you're not permitted to use violence or threats against people. If this stuff goes to court, for example, folks at the courts are going to consider the context of this. Was this something that was done under stress or duress? Why was this conduct as such? Was the employer goading the employees, for example, to get into more violent acts? These are things that will be judged in context. So some states, for example, have what they refer to as anti-picket laws, and it means you cannot have unlawful strikes. If you are going on strike on your own, like a wildcat strike, or if you get violent, the state can actually send the state police in to break it up. That's a general rule of thumb. If a strike becomes violent, the police are going to be within their legal rights to back it up. And another thing, too, in terms of private property, for example, if I have a house that's right next to a facility, let's say the United Mine Workers have a facility, and my house or my property is right next door, I'm within my legal rights to ask the strikers to move off my private property because I'm not involved in the strike as well. If you also have a strike going on, you're within your legal rights as a company to ask people to move off your property. You guys notice we were talking about the GM strike. Where were most of the folks standing who were on strike? Were they right in front of the gates, or were they across the street? You remember? They were all across the street on public property. There's nothing to keep you from protesting on public property. You can absolutely prohibit somebody from striking on private property if you're the owner. The only time that you can allow people or can be forced to allow people onto your property is if there's no public property immediately adjacent. Yeah, they can be allowed on your property. You may be forced to allow them. So again, if there's no private property or there's no public property available. What we're really talking about here, guys, in terms of strikes in general, we're talking about balancing the rights of people to express their opinion, aka the First Amendment, versus the employer who has a property they want to keep going as well. And these things fall out in the middle. For example, when we start talking about the United Mine Workers, the biggest goal the mine workers had in their strike to get the strike over was to keep the coal companies essentially from being able to do business. So they were stopping the free flow of commerce. And we also get into what's called labor peace, and that means are we getting into violent acts that are causing detriment to the public and ultimately public interest. You guys remember, in the early 1980s, President Reagan broke a union involving public interest. What union was that? Yes? Yep, and so we're talking about a union that was operating in the public interest. Nobody wants to fly the friendly skies if they can't be sure they're not going to run into another plane. And it comes down to big unions like transportation, things that control our food and water supplies. Those unions are considered to be in a public interest, which is why those unions are technically not supposed to be able to go on strike in the first place. Before I continue, guys, we're making good time here today on purpose. Can I get a question or comment from anywhere in the room? Funny. I think part of it is the fact since I ate a 2-pound donut at the beginning of class, my blood sugar is starting to bottom out. This is like really weird. Yes?
What's your favorite part about the holidays?
Like, are we talking like Thanksgiving or all the holidays?
The holiday season.
Just, you know what? I have a twin brother, and I hardly ever get to see him. He's my best friend, and we have a tradition every year for the holidays. We go and we make one trip around the mall. Neither one of us buys anything. It's just like being a kid again. And we'll go out, and there's a local bar in Altoona called the Knickerbocker, and we'll go and have dinner and an amazing beer there and just talk about the old days and talk about the people we miss, people who aren't with us anymore. You know, it's all about family, and he's my only family, and so he's who I get to spend that part of the holiday with. How about you? What's your favorite part of the holiday?
Mine is at school. I just love the food.
What's not cool about that, man?
Yeah, and I like to spend time with my family too.
How many siblings do you have?
One sister. I have one sister.
One sister. You guys get together?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
And
Yeah.
my dog's shy.
Say that again?
My dog's shy too.
What kind of dog?
He's a lab.
Nice. Man, labs are great dogs. They're so friendly. So friendly. Anybody else? What's your favorite part of the holidays, guys? Anybody else want to share before we jump back in? I want to keep the spirit high in the conversation going. Like that donut is like really hitting me hard right now, and I'm being serious about that, Sarah. That was I think I ate about 4 bags of sugar when I ate that donut. So anybody else have anything they want to share about the holidays? I'm going to try to not stroke out on you guys up here because it's hitting me hard. In terms of when we refer to a secondary employer, guys, all right, if we're General Motors and our United Auto Workers go on strike, stuff that goes into a car doesn't come just from GM. It comes from other places as well. The tires might come from Firestone. The electronics might come from Apple or Google even. So these things come from other places, and those secondary employers are affected by the strike. Well, here's the trick. Those secondary employers can become business allies when they go on strike as well. So they for example, if you have somebody who is working for GM, working with the United Auto Workers, and we decide, well, we've got an electronics facility that makes components for GMC and Chevy pickups, well, we're going on strike as well because these guys are trying to get a benefit and we'd like to have it too. So business allies can be people so closely associated with the primary union that's on strike that can almost appear to be part of the same company. And they sometimes will go out on strike together. So in terms of how this works, guys, technically it's considered to be an unfair labor practice if you go out on strike just because. So let's say, for example, our secondary employer, our secondary union, goes out on strike because they're not happy with the United Auto Workers not getting their due, and they're going to go out as well. Unless they've got a legitimate reason to go out on strike. Let me give you an example. The United Auto Workers were negotiating their collective bargaining agreement. If the secondary electronics company had no reason to go out on strike other than to back these guys up, it's technically a violation. It's technically an unfair labor practice. This also can lead to something we call sympathy strikes. And that means, for example, even if they're not secondary employers, other businesses may say, we're going to stand with our brothers and sisters in the Teamsters Union, and we're going to go out on strike with them. Like, say, for example, we had a number of unions that cover grocery stores. If one of the grocery store unions went on strike, for example, and the Teamsters went on strike as the folks who deliver the groceries, that could be considered either a secondary strike or a sympathy strike, depending on how they did it. We also have something called the More Dry Dock Doctrine. And dry dock comes from the old days when we used ships. And what this means, guys, is if you've got a secondary employer, somebody who works closely with your primary employer. Let's say, for example, we've got a company, a grocery store that's out on strike. And we've got a grocery delivery vehicle that's coming through. Those strikers technically can't mess with the secondary employer who's trying to deliver food. That person who's trying to get in has to be allowed in. That's called the More Dry Dock Doctrine. And what that means simply is, even if you're expressing your grievance with your collective bargaining agreement, you can't keep somebody else from doing their job. And the other part of it too, you also, if there's a dedicated gate at your facility specifically for one company that's not involved in your strike, and that's the only place they have access to your facility, it's called the Reserve Gate Doctrine. You cannot strike and block that entrance either. You've got to allow the company still to try to conduct business while you're figuring out your issues as well. Then we've also got the General Electric Doctrine. Guys, GE used to be one of the biggest and most important companies in the United States. They made everything. They were one of the companies that when we looked at them, we could gauge the health of the country based on how well GE was doing. GE's sort of fallen out of favor the last few years, and this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, labor and union relations. I'm just curious if any of you know what happened here. GE recently found out how irrelevant they were. Last year, they left a certain business measure. They left a certain business list, and it was one of the original companies on this list. They finally left it last year. What list am I talking about? I asked the question poorly. There's a list of companies we keep our eye on. And GE used to be on that list, and
Forbes.
It's not Forbes, but you're close. Sorry? Not the Fortune. It's actually the S&P. I'm sorry, the Dow. I left the Dow. It was one of the original companies on the Dow Jones Industrial Index, and they left them last year because the company is doing so poorly. GE is not in good shape right now, but the very fact that there's something called the GE Doctrine means that it's essentially another way that picketing is not allowed. So picketing is not allowed at a gate designated by the primary employer, by a secondary employer, if it's the only way in and out of a company. So it's kind of a play on the gate doctrine we talked about before. Then we get into what we refer to as product picketing, and that means, for example, you might picket a place where a product is being sold that was being produced by union labor. You could have United Auto Workers, for example, picketing at a General Motors dealership or at a Chevy dealership. And you have to make sure, however, if you're going to do this, if you're going to stand up and picket in front of a grocery store to boycott a specific product, for example, you've got to make sure your documentation points out that you're not picketing the store, you're not picketing this business, you're picketing a specific product. And again, if you're causing people not to be able to go into a store, if you're blocking entrances or exits, it could become an unfair labor practice and illegal as well. So, finally, guys, we're moving into the last part of our session for today. If you've got a strike that ultimately puts people at danger, you're the air traffic control workers, if you are the national rail workers, for example, all of these things are industries that are not supposed to go on strike because of their public interest in the fact that people rely on them. If a group decides to go on strike, if the trains go on strike, if the air traffic controllers go on strike, the president can intervene and they can send National Guard troops to make sure people go back to work. Worst case scenario, they can actually send in people to take over those jobs if necessary. We saw it happen in the 80s. It may happen again. And we're not going to cover the procedure for that because we wrapped up the chapter, guys. And what my goal for today was to finish, which we did. So, guys, what we're going to do, I'm going to let you go early today, number one. Number two, when we get back, we're going to go over the collective bargaining agreement exercise very first day. I also will be giving you guys the materials to get ready for the final, which will be scheduled during our normal final time online. You're going to have a total of 3 chapters. One we covered in class, the other 2 will be covered online. You've got to do that test during the prescribed period for me to keep it legal with what I have to do. We all good? Thank you, guys.